Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director at Breakthrough. Thank you so much for tuning into this, the 30th episode of this podcast, and as such, the finale of our third season. After this episode, we'll be taking a short break, but you can look forward to a new season in a couple months. For this episode, I spoke with Carly Vinn, principal consultant at Osprey Insights and member of the Nature Needs Half Steering Committee. Carly's efforts have focused on working with nonprofits, tribes, corporations, private foundations, and agencies to conduct biodiversity assessments and to design, fund, and implement conservation programs. She's overseen conservation planning processes in Asia, Africa, and South America, and recently established several public-private partnerships to create impactful conservation programs across the Western United States and Arctic Alaska. In this conversation, we talk quite a bit about the new-ish Nature Needs Half vision and its accomplishments so far. Carly Vinn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I wanted to start by asking you to tell us about the Nature Needs Half vision. Sort of what is the Nature Needs Half vision? What makes it sort of evolutionary or revolutionary in conservation philosophy and practice? And then sort of what is your role in that community?
Yeah, the Nature Needs Half movement is really about setting forth an ambitious but clear target of conserving half of Earth for nature and humanity.
And what are the tools for doing that? What are the practices? What are the laws? What are the strategies that the Nature Needs Half community principally aims to employ?
Yeah, well, it really, as is recognized now, is meant to be an open-ended movement where people or organizations can join. It seems revolutionary or ambitious, as you stated, in many ways and in some circles, but I think really came from and has been recognized by, for example, many indigenous groups for millennia in terms of a way to manage and think about our relationship with the earth and managing lands. So tools include everything from, if you're imagining an ambitious agenda, like setting aside half the earth where nature is conserved, you can imagine a lot of tools like traditional protected areas. There's community-based conservation lands. There are shared landscapes where there might be biodiversity conservation or wildlife conservation as a focus, but there's also certain other uses of the land, hunting, fishing, recreation, of course. And the tools are, the vision, I think, is aspirational in a sense of setting out kind of what's needed for nature. And really, at the end of the day, the tools and the approach very much depend, of course, on what local and regional actors or groups or decision makers decide needs to happen in their backyard to help realize that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that the vision and the movement are born from the fact that we are still losing species and land area to human activity in 2019, and also that the tools of sort of conservation practice have not always been sort of respectful of local conditions or local communities. Is that right?
Yes, I think I'd say first and foremost about saying what's needed. So if your goals, and not assuming this is for everyone, but if your goals are to conserve most of the abundance and diversity of life on Earth and have healthy, regulation of ecosystem processes and provisioning of clean air, clean water, and likely to have a success or chance at climate stabilization, we need to be not only doing all the process and the traditional things that we've done in conservation, but we need to say kind of what's needed at a very basic level. And at Nature Needs Half, it's a way of doing that, saying like we need likely at least half, and for that half to be connected in order to have all of these things.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by connected?
Yeah, so often and this is getting more to global protected area strategies and targets, which is part of what the initiative and movement are about. But there are targets, like right now, the signatories to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which get together every 10 years to set protected area targets globally as a community that the signatories agree to. Right now, it's 17%. And there are also targets about how much of that needs to be connected, again, to protect the diversity of life on Earth. And so by connected, we mean that these area targets or land-based water targets for conservation need to have not be isolated. And that depends, of course, on what you're trying to manage for. But as species, and many of these targets will be, or protected areas will be too small to maintain species on their own, and they'll need to disperse or move from one place to another. And particularly with changing conditions and climate change, need the ability to move or migrate to other areas. We need to make sure that these areas that we've set aside for nature are connected in a sense.
I want to talk about climate change. In your recent paper, in which you outlined a global deal for nature, you emphasize the connection between biodiversity loss, between land use change, and climate change. So can you tell us about this global deal for nature and about that connection?
Yes. Here we're trying to make the case that essentially there's a lot of the solutions that have been proposed for climate change include how to sequester carbon, how to keep carbon in the ground, avoided emissions. And there's many, of course, pathways and approaches that will be necessary to that, from transitioning our energy infrastructures. And part of it that is part of one of those pathways, and an important pathway, is addressing the land-based opportunity to sequester and store carbon. I should say land and sea-based. And so we really feel that while there's many pathways to keeping below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees warming, which I think most of us would agree is desirable, one important and often underlooked one is maintaining the integrity of natural systems, keeping natural systems intact and highly functioning. And so we were arguing in that paper, in part, that in order for a 2 degree or 1.5 degree target to be realized, we also need to think a lot about keeping nature intact in large ways, and particularly in areas that are really important for carbon storage. And so, for example, for a Paris Accord to be successful, we would need a global deal for nature, which similarly could, at a high level, set ambitious targets or the global targets, but then also provide the local and regional, national support to make that happen. And we also realize that in order to meet the biodiversity goals and conserve the diversity of life on Earth, we need to ensure that we're staying below 2 degrees, or it looks like new evidence really saying 1.5 degrees warming. And so really kind of trying to bring these two elements together.
You mentioned parts of the world that are particularly important for carbon storage and carbon sequestration. In your writing, you talk about, quote, biologically important areas of the world, what I think other people also refer to as biodiversity hotspots. So can you talk about the sort of challenge within conservation of identifying and protecting particularly important areas or ecoregions of the world?
Yeah, this is something I think that people that think about climate science a lot, often I think us as conservation biologists or biodiversity scientists are a little bit envious, because you can put a sensor up on a volcano in Hawaii and get kind of a reading of what's happening with climate. And obviously it's not that simple, but with biological diversity, it's so unevenly distributed across Earth's surface, which of course is what's amazing and wonderful about how diverse places on the planet are unique and ecologically important, but it also it matters in terms of where you are focused and what you're trying to conserve. So if you're trying to conserve life on Earth, you need to have both representation of different areas or places of the planet, as well as a focus on those that have a lot of diversity.
Yeah, and I bring it up because for the precise reason that you mentioned, we often think about these global environmental problems as global problems. Climate change, even things like biodiversity loss and land use change are often expressed or quantified in these global terms. But the solutions, at the very least, are often very local, and often the problems are more concentrated at a local level, particularly when that comes to biodiversity loss and land use change. What are some of the characteristics that make for a biologically important region or a biodiversity hotspot?
Yeah, well, the biodiversity hotspots have, as defined back in the 90s by Myers, were based on plant endemism and diversity. And a lot of what we'll see are correlates with the tropical zones where climate is relatively stable and is basically allowed for a flourishing of diversity over time. So there can be, at a global scale, you could look at a map of, for example, people that coined the term biodiversity hotspots, look at areas that represented a relatively small portion of the world, say 10% of the world, but had more than half of the biological diversity in those places. And usually when we're talking about that is high concentrations of numbers of species in relatively small or localized areas, which is just one way that people use to prioritize conservation. There's folks who say, well, we should focus on the hotspots because we can get as many species and as much representation as life in as small of areas as possible. And then complementary to that would be maybe an ecoregion or representation approach where you're like, okay, let's try to figure out how to capture all life on Earth, which certainly would involve these biodiversity hotspots, but then also include areas that might be relatively species